Welcome to the Radical Center Podcast, Episode 2. I'm your co-host, Joe Kopsick. We got A.M. Casto on the line. Say hi.
Hey, how's it going?
So we finished up our presidential elections episode without really touching on a few things A.M. wanted to mention. So he's gonna talk a little bit about classical liberalism and progressivism.
For my opening statement regarding classical liberalism, I often see that the left kind of attacks classical liberalism because they think it's incompatible with the times. They think that the only reason why classical liberalism exists because they only care about upheaving the status quo, and that's just simply not true, because classical liberalism is an individualistic ideology that is compatible with all types of changes. So I believe it's the true progressive reform as far as self-reliance, being the self-made man, really. I mean, we've been doing it for generations to this very day of self-reliance, self-dependence and stuff. But now, within probably the past 50, 60 some years, government has kind of getting more and more involved, and it creates helplessness, really. I feel as though that classical liberalism is really the true progressive policy, because government, it doesn't promote any incentive to want to do a progressive society on the scale of everything. If anything, the government's like an anti-progressive reform. Like, they want to take control of everything. Then that's not progress. That's just backlashing. And I just feel as though that's not how progressive it should truly be like. And that's my opening statement.
Yeah, it's like if you endorse progressivism, you gotta allow the progress of individual human beings. Progress is subjective, it's in the eye of the beholder. You want to have progression of individual rights and civil liberties. You don't want to have as much progression of the size and scope of government, because the Constitution says the government is supposed to promote useful arts and science by securing patents, trademarks, and copyrights. But when you take that overboard, then you're stealing taxpayers to prop up old companies that should be dying out because they don't actually innovate.
They think that they own the property just because they have a patent on one level of the product, but other people have the right to sell that product as well. Just because you have a patent doesn't mean you own the field that the product is in.
Just because you can produce one type of product doesn't mean that everyone who wants a slightly similar product has to buy from you.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone has the right to tweak it the way they want to do it and sell it and make profit just as much. That's perfectly fine. You can't own that. There's a if you try to come out with something and make the exact same formula and name it the exact same thing, that's totally different. That's an idea. But the whole subject of matter is that they think that they own the right to the intellectual property. If they think that, in a sense, theft itself, they think other people are thefting, but really they're the ones doing the thefts of intellectual property.
We have a mercantilist system where government intervenes in economy to help domestic producers, and the Constitution is just a little bit more mercantilist than it is free market, and we're supposed to reward innovators by having a meritocracy, but instead we're stealing from ourselves and giving them all our money and propping them out long after they should go bankrupt and after industry should die out because they're obsolete, and that we create a monopoly instead of a real free market.
Which then creates people losing the incentive to want to actually come up with ideas, want to progress ideas that are already around, because people think, oh well, this person has control of this. There's no way I can do anything about it. That's like with oil and stuff, like OPEC and ExxonMobil. They control it all, really. If you wanted to go by yourself as a single independent, have an oil firm, there'd be no way, because those companies buy you out just like that. As soon as you get in, they pretty much got you out of there.
Yeah, and it's you're not an established company, so there's no reason the government would want to subsidize you even. They don't even want to give you artificial supports, much less let you compete in a genuine free market by removing those subsidies from the already existing companies.
They don't want to give any incentive as far as the whole idea of motive. That's our whole being, is the whole motivation of competitiveness, and when you take that away, it makes people not want to try as hard, which ultimately causes a societal collapse. That's what kind of happened with the Soviet Union, with communism. They had a planned economy and everything was controlled. Well, people, they didn't have the incentive to work because they couldn't move up and stuff, and they were being harassed, all that stuff, human rights abuse, and basically it just went to shit.
Right, and they were also forced to buy products through the government that were more expensive. So the Soviet satellites that were the most successful after the collapse of the Soviet Union were the ones that had adequately developed black markets. They had to develop a black market in every good and service in order to save money, to undercut the government that was trying to overcharge them for all those services.
They control the market, and it causes the prices to go up. That's exactly how Obamacare is going right now. Like, it's basically giving you less choices and your premiums are going up.
Another point about intellectual property, people try to compare internet piracy to theft, but piracy leaves the original copy intact. Theft does not. It's not really stealing, you're just sharing your own property. And when you don't allow people to share their own property, then you're taking away part of their bundle of property rights of that thing. You're making it not their property anymore.
If you legally buy something and you share it with somebody, you bought it, therefore you have the right to share it. You obviously paid your due and you own the right to that physical copy. Even copy on the computer and stuff, you own the right to that. You should be able to share it with people. That's not theft, that's not intellectual property theft or anything. That's just like how we have like a shared economy, like people that basically can't afford stuff. A lot of people don't want to spend like a lot of money on music. I mean, if you go on iTunes, $1 of a song, that adds up, like a whole album's like 10 or 15 bucks. Well, people aren't going to want to pay for that. They're going to go to the route of whether it's free or cheap. Like one of those services like Spotify, like $10 a month, you get to listen to all the albums you want and stuff, or go out and actually buy an album at the same price and only get just that album. They're going to go for the like scrap and saving and get their best choice.
This really illustrates an anarchist principle, is that no matter how hard the government tries to clamp down on something, it's just going to create a freedom vacuum, the opposite of a power vacuum. And some innovator is going to come in and find a way to provide that service, like Spotify, like you mentioned, or Uber, for example. They're going to find a way to provide that service better or cheaper or both or more efficient.
There's always going to be something new coming out, and having government stepping in and like regulating it to the point, it ultimately is what causes monopolies. I think. Like when only like a few firms have like control of stuff, not only does it like give lack of product, it also gives like lack of purpose. Why do I want to go out and compete with this guy and stuff when he pretty much has the government on his side, and I have nobody. I have no word. I don't have a pot to piss in. This guy, is all the way at the top. He's getting government back grants and all that. I can't even get anything. They want to make it hard. Government regulation makes it hard for the bottom to get up.
Like a lot of people said after the financial crisis, where's my bailout? We're stealing from the poor to give to the rich.
Stealing from Peter to give to Paul.
The relevant term here is regulatory capture. When FDR closed all the banks and 5 days later they opened up and everyone trusted them again, people trust businesses just because they're regulated, even if they're really not, just because they think they see them being regulated. They might not be, but just because they're subject to regulations, with all the cronyism and lobbying involved that they choose to not think about and don't see or whatever, they trust old established companies with a shitload of privileges just because they're regulated, and they trust them less than they do some new businessman who might be a real innovator and who values real competition in a real free market more than these established businesses.
People will trade security for freedom and possibilities and opportunities. Like they want to stay in their shell and they don't want to explore and live life and build up. They want to conserve what they got. They're more worried about losing than gaining.
They're so afraid of danger and risk that they not only do they never take a risk again, they stop future generations, they stop their own children from being able to use their freedom to do risky things like win wars, or save people's lives, or have slightly dangerous jobs. And that's why we're all unemployed, because no one ever gave us a chance.
Exactly. And plus, these days, everybody works for somebody else. They don't work for themselves. Like we've like made it convenient to work for somebody else. And I think that goes back to my whole point about like progressivism is classical liberalism, because it promotes self-reliance and self-help. You're building yourself, you're working for yourself instead of like hoarding your labor for cheap profit.
We're all forced to work for a society that really doesn't have our best interests at heart anymore. We don't get taxed 50%, but they take away enough freedoms for us that the freedoms and taxes they take is more than 50% of the real value of the effort that we put in. Do you work for the government, or does the government work for you, like Andrew Napolitano said?
That reminds me of part of a speech Grover Cleveland said when he vetoed I forget what bill it was, but he basically said that people should support the government should not support the people. A lot of people criticized him during the recession in 1893 because he was sitting by not doing anything, but really he was wanting to give society a chance to get back on its feet on its own. Only that at a total economic disaster, the government should intervene, and I personally, but that would be with months and months and months of letting it try to solve itself. Though the people support the government should not support the people. People vote, they're part of the government system, so obviously they're going to support some form of government in some aspect, but the government should not control or regulate their lives to an excess. They want to teach self-help and self-reliance versus causing self-helplessness.
Yeah, it's like the government should earn the trust of the people, and getting the people's support in that way. The purpose of government is, as Barry Goldwater said, it's not to help people from cradle to grave. You shouldn't treat adults like children when they're not children anymore. So we also wanted to show our presidential trivia credentials. So we've challenged each other to name all the presidents as quickly as we can, and then we're going to do another quiz before we move on to another topic. So I'm going to name them all, and I'm going to have AM do it. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Adams, Jackson, Van Buren, Harrison, Tyler, Polk, Taylor, Fillmore, Pierce, Buchanan, Lincoln, Johnson, Grant, Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, Cleveland, Harrison, Cleveland, McKinley, Roosevelt, Taft, Wilson, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, FDR, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, Reagan, Clinton, Obama, Clinton, Jesus, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump.
I believe you got them all right. Now let's see if I can get them all right. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Quincy Adams, Jackson, Van Buren, Harrison, Tyler, Taylor, Polk, Taylor, Fillmore, Pierce, Buchanan, Lincoln, Johnson, Grant, Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, McKinley, Cleveland, Harrison, Cleveland again, McKinley, Roosevelt, Taft, Wilson, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, FDR, Truman, Eisenhower, Nixon, Johnson, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush again, and Obama and Trump. Kind of fumble there on the last.
Well, you'll make it up in vice presidential trivia. So I'm going to ask AM who the vice president was to whatever president I name, and he's going to name a president, and I'm going to tell you their number and what years they served. Who were FDR's vice presidents, in order, if you could?
John Nance Garner, Henry Wallace, and Harry Truman. President Coolidge.
Coolidge was the he was the 30th, 1923 to 1929. Who was Andrew Johnson's vice president?
Trick question. He didn't have any.
I didn't even know that.
Presidents died. A lot of them didn't nominate a VP. Actually, there was an amendment to the Constitution that dealt with that. As far as appointing a VP, the only president to actually ever get to use that was Ford. He became president without ever being elected. He got up the charts without even running at all.
They say he was selected, not elected. The other interesting fact of that is that John Tyler ascended from the vice presidency to the presidency after the death of William Henry Harrison.
Tyler basically, there was no really constitutional authority on whether the vice president could ascend to it. But he basically stuck his foot in the door and said, "Hey, look, I'm president now."
Yeah, it's this is what makes the most sense. This is happening.
And if you send letters addressing Vice President John Tyler, I won't open them or I won't respond to them. It has to be the President Tyler.
Yeah, there you go with that bully pulpit. Who was Tyler's vice president?
He didn't have one. Before Ford, all the vice presidents that became president after their predecessor died, they didn't have a vice president until later on when they ran for president.
So once they picked their running mate.
When Kennedy died, Johnson didn't have a vice president until he won re-election.
Yeah, it must have been weird for Tyler going 3 3/4 years without a vice president. It's
he was also the only president to get expelled from his own party.
Oh, really? The Whigs?
Yeah.
It would have been interesting to see, with no vice president during most of Tyler's term, who cast the tie-breaking votes in the Senate. That'd be interesting.
Yeah, that is a good question. Never really thought of that, but it is true. Because there would be no president of the Senate, because the president of the Senate is VP.
Yeah, like you have a State of the Union address, there's just one guy sitting behind you.
That would be interesting.
I think most people would appreciate seeing that these days. Heard
Yeah.
about a guy like covered up, Paul Ryan covered up half of his TV because he didn't want to see Ryan back when it was Obama and Biden. Well, now they just got to cover the whole TV if they're a Democrat.
Wilson was the first president to do a State of the Union address in person since John Adams. That whole period of time, they didn't do it in person. They just sent it to their state to Congress. But he was the first one to actually address, and it kind of set a precedent of presidents, later on addressing Congress during the State of the Union.
I actually remember 8th grade history class, our teacher, she said that the Constitution says that every year the president must give an address. And I knew offhand at the age of 14, no, it says from time to time the president shall inform the Congress of the State of the Union. And she had to admit she was right.
President Taft.
Taft was the 27th, and that would have been 1909 to 1917. Who was Taft's vice president?
James Sherman. President Pierce.
Oh, damn. 14th. 1853 to 1857. Well, might have to check the fact. Wow, really? Yeah, the fact that you can confirm that. Yeah, we're to be trusted.
Before he got elected, his son died. He got killed in a train accident. His 11-year-old son. His name was Benny and stuff, which that ultimately shaped his presidency. They said he was an alcoholic too.
Yeah, that probably got worse after his son died. It must have been depressing.
Yeah. He ended up dying of cirrhosis of the liver, 69 years old.
I remember his campaign slogan, "We poked them in 1844 and we shall pierce them in 1852 or whatever." You want to move on to the party systems?
It's basically the evolution of the whole political system throughout America. The evolution of our political system, our governing.
For those who don't know, a party system is a way of explaining the two major parties in a certain era of politics, usually 20, 40, sometimes 50 years, 50 most recently, because as you were saying, we can't figure out when one party system ends and when one starts. We kind of have to figure it out as we go. That's a way of understanding the ideological shifts in the parties and why and how parties arise and change and go extinct and stuff.
And also too, during those party systems, they also have an era, for instance, the Jacksonian era, the Reagan era, the progressive era, the era of good feeling. There's eras within those party systems, like presidents that made a big impact.
Gilded Age is an example. Really influential presidents have doctrines named after them, like the Monroe Doctrine and the Bush Doctrine, Wilson Doctrine.
Yeah. What's interesting about the doctrines and stuff, Monroe Doctrine, he wasn't even the one who actually wrote it. It was actually John Quincy Adams. But the fact that it happened under his administration, he pretty much got credit for it. They call it that.
Was Adams in Monroe's cabinet?
Yeah, he was a Secretary of State.
Did you say that Jackson was John Quincy Adams' Secretary of State because of a compromise they made?
No, that was Henry Clay. He chose him as Secretary of State in exchange for him picking him because he was the Speaker of the House.
So do you want to introduce the first party system? You said that was 1792?
Yeah, the first party system was the system between 1792 and 1824. The leaders of the political parties of the Federalist Party. The Federalist Party really, after John Adams, kind of didn't have it existed, but they never really got any ground after that. He was one of the leaders of the party. After 1820, it folded. One of the elections, James Monroe won. He basically won unanimously. There's only one electoral vote going to somebody else, and that was John Adams. And that's because they didn't want the fact that Washington won both times twice unanimously. They wanted to keep that as precedent. It's pretty much he won unanimously, but they wanted to keep tradition of Washington being the first.
Yeah, there's no kind of democracy that freedom lovers love more than unanimous democracy.
So from the first party system to about the near end of the second party system, elections were actually they held elections monthly, kind of like primaries. It wasn't until when Zachary Taylor ran in 1848 that they actually did every state on the same day. It would be like a primary, each day a state would vote, and actually back then voting was so regulated. You had to have proper land qualifications and stuff. Instead of actually going to a ballot, cast your vote, they basically did voice votes, and they'd write it down, and They basically have big parties and drinking.
Another fact about early elections is the president didn't get inaugurated until something like March 3rd or 4th
Yeah,
because
exactly.
the votes took so long to tally in those days. And I just want to make a comment on federalism. It's weird how the definition of federalism has kind of changed over time. People like Hamilton and the Adamses are associated with federalism, and that's associated with the idea of like a central bank. But even then, that was back in the days when people who were advocating a central bank still cared a hell of a lot about freedom. And federalism really is a balance between the central government in Washington and the state, local governments, and people. It's about duly delegated, negotiated, separate spheres of policy influence. Whereas now federalism means top-down dictation, and that's what Obama Democrats, FDR Democrats are all on board with that.
I was thinking that like it was the other way around, like federalism. What was possibly because Nixon imposed a thing called the New Federalism, and it basically balance between states and national government. And I was thinking that Washington and Adams increased government, especially Adams during that time period of the first party system, where basically the Constitution wasn't even 12 or 13 years old. He like passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which made it a crime to criticize the government. His name's on the Constitution, and he abides by a government that's going to go against the Constitution. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me. A lot of the founding fathers, they wrote the Constitution, but a lot of them ended up going against it themselves. That was really the era. That was like the founding fathers era of running government.
In case anyone out there wants to learn a little bit more about the different types of federalism, you can look up cooperative federalism, corporative federalism, dual federalism, and triple federalism, where you not only have states balancing the power of the central government, you also have local and county governments balancing it out. It's almost like in the early days of the Republic, federalism and anti-federalism are almost synonymous. 1825, it's the time when the last president to sign the Constitution has just left office, makes way for some really serious negotiations to happen to keep the country going the way it's supposed to be run. Maybe it didn't exactly work out, and that leads us to the Jackson Democrats.
Which is what began the second party system. Martin Van Buren was really a big guy behind the Democrats. He just wasn't he wasn't good in all, good politician, like campaigning and all that stuff, but as actually doing something.
Yeah, he said he could talk to anyone. He was really good at talking to normal people.
He was able to mingle with anybody really, which made him a good politician. He wasn't like a backwoods brawler. He wasn't like the frontiersman like Jackson was, but he was able to carry himself in such a way he could communicate with people like that. Heck, Jackson was one of the people that he tended to feel threatened by people like that, but for some reason, Van Buren was the one guy that he was able to become close to, that was someone that he could potentially mistrust. When Van Buren became president, not only did he inherit Jackson's bank mess and everything, but he also was kind of seen as Jackson's third term, because when presidents of the same party, the predecessor of the incoming president is the same party as the president, that's often seen as the third term of the president. If a different president is seen as a third term, then it must be even more difficult for them to establish their mark.
To bring in an example from modern times, people said they wouldn't vote for Hillary because she would have been Obama third term. She really would have just been Dick Cheney's fifth term. Van Buren, being a Dutch guy from New York, speaking a second language, Dutch was his first language, that would enable him to talk to all kinds of people, and especially being an abolitionist, you could hang out with powerful people who wanted to keep the status quo, but also advocate, real freedom for everybody, African Americans.
Here's another interesting thing too, and this has to do with both the elections of 1836 and 1840. But let me start with the 1836 one. The 1836 presidential election was the only presidential election where a party nominated multiple candidates to try to stop the other one. During the election of 1836, there was about 4 or 5 Whigs that were nominated. Both of the nominees' personality qualities. The Harrison camp attacked Van Buren for being this aristocrat, not in touch with the common man. But actually, William Henry Harrison, he had a PhD and a medical degree, and he came from a wealthy family, planter and all that. But he somehow manipulated the image of the log cabin. He was able to kind of play to the common man theme. Similar to what Trump has done, he's kind of a populist.
To recap, we had 1792 to 1824, the Federalists or Anti-Federalists, whatever you want to call them, versus the Democratic Republicans. Then we had the rise of Jackson. The second party system was the Jacksonian Democrats versus the Whigs. And then the Whigs died out. You just want to name your Whig presidents real quick. You got William Henry Harrison, and then he died in office, and then John Tyler. Is it Taylor and Fillmore?
My reasoning why the Whig Party died is obviously has to do with exactly with the president. Harrison and Tyler, they didn't share the same view on government. Tyler was actually a small government Democrat, and then he became a Whig. He only joined the Whig Party because he started opposing Jackson and Van Buren's policy. But he was a small government Democrat, and then shifted to the Whig Party for some reason. It almost seemed like with the Whig Party, whenever there was a president, his Whig successor would always try to undo what he passed. Like with Taylor, Taylor was he was trying to preserve the Union, and he wanted to veto the Compromise of 1850, which basically gave sentiments to both sides on the whole slavery debate. Like with the South, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which basically any slave caught in the North could possibly return to the South to their owner. And,
yeah, they have to extradite them to the state of their
North
origin.
wasn't happy about that, and the fact that there was concessions gave to the North was basically a proposed American law to ban slavery in any territory acquired from Mexico in the Mexican War. So that was one of the issues that the South wasn't happy about. They wanted to expand slavery, but that Compromise of 1850 actually halted it, so nobody was really happy in the end. Turned the tide towards the Civil War.
Right, and then a few years later, you had the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and then the Republican Party was formed that same year, 1854. And I'm noticing a theme here: too much compromise.
Too much compromise is what causes the whole destruction in the first place.
Yeah, and now people are talking about we need more compromise, and it's like, no, we don't, because they compromise on the 90% of the big government issues that screw us over. Like we mentioned, Monroe had Adams as his Secretary of State, and I think the Whigs probably chose their running mates because, Jacksonian democracy was such a powerful force that they couldn't get elected without having a former Democrat on their ticket. So that leads into the third-party system.
The third-party system was between 1854 and 1890. That basically was one of the more interesting systems because it dealt with both the Civil War and the Reconstruction after the Civil War. When it started, it was really started when around the time the Kansas-Nebraska Act happened, which was passed by President Pierce, basically saying that it gave popular sovereignty the state of, I believe, Kansas to choose whether or not they wanted slavery. Well, it got rid of the Missouri Compromise because slavery was banned north of Missouri, but since they got rid of it, it basically caused, I believe it was called Bleeding Kansas, it caused collision between the pro-slavery people and the anti-slavery people, and it led to a disaster in Pierce's presidency. And they wanted to do it in compromise, which goes back to what you just said about compromise in exchange for, because they wanted to build a railroad system, a very good railroad system, but they had to do it out of Atlanta. Well, the South wanted to remove the compromise of 1820, and they did that, and it became a mess.
I just want to throw a little fact in here because it's another thing I was taught that was incorrect in school. I was taught that the Mason-Dixon line is the line of latitude that separates Virginia and North Carolina. I found out just last year after I heard Martin O'Malley say, "I'm the only governor south of the Mason-Dixon line," that blah, blah, blah. I'm like, what? You're from the north? And then I found out that the Mason-Dixon line actually divides Maryland from Delaware and Pennsylvania. So it's like, who the hell has taught that? I wasn't.
We continue with the third-party system. With Pierce and Buchanan, it was basically 2 terms of the same president, same policies. Democrats didn't want to nominate Pierce, but they wanted Buchanan because he was the only person that could really, possibly win against John C. Fremont. He was pretty much one of the only few Democrats that could possibly even win that election that year because he kind of had a personality that wouldn't really offend people. He ended up being a doughface, which is a northerner with southern sympathies, like Pierce was. And it basically made him look like a traitor to the North, as with Pierce. And going back off to Zachary Taylor again, what's interesting is that he was a Southerner, but he was pro-Union. But when Pierce and Buchanan became president, they were Northerners, but Southern sympathies. They, for some reason, were from this area, but they chose this that have more involvement with the opposite side of the United States. To get to the beginning of the Civil War, what caused the Civil War is the fact that Buchanan stood by doing nothing, and he basically on his final day said to Lincoln, "If you are as happy as I am to be entering office as I am leaving, you're indeed a happy man."
Yeah, there's some debate over what started the Civil War. Some
Yeah,
say
there was a
it's
lot of factors. A lot of people say it could be derived from the begin with the annexation of Texas in 1845, which was when President Tyler, a couple days before he left office on March 2nd, 1845, he annexed Texas. He wanted a favorite expansion policy. It pretty much set the way for the question of slavery. Do we want it in Texas? Do we want it west, California? It kind of stirred the pot more and more. Where the Civil War really began was at Fort Sumter. Lincoln sent and he obviously knew that he was going to get himself in the war, but he didn't want to be the one start the war. But he basically sent troops to Fort Sumter.
there's debate over whether it was slavery was the real cause of the Civil War, or whether it was just some people say it's states' rights, but that kind of oversimplifies a little bit.
That's kind of a code word for basically saying being pro-slavery. It's a way to kind of get around the Constitution.
The national government increased tariffs on ports of southern cities. There were slave cities or enslaved states, so they like doubled the tariffs overnight. It's almost like taxing these states as if they're foreign countries. Like tariffs are supposed to be collected from imports and exports from foreign countries.
Well, not only that, but he also suspended habeas corpus for a lot of southern, Confederates. One of the guys was related to Francis Scott Key, the guy behind Star Spangled Banner. Lincoln did some pretty bold moves at the risk of defying the Constitution. Like with Lincoln, he was really the first president to kind of stamp or down the Constitution. I understood why he did it. Other presidents did, but he was really the one that set a fire of constitutional, suspension.
Yeah, and that set the stage for Wilson and the way he expanded the Alien and Sedition Act and arrested people for criticizing him in World War One. For the first 3 or 4, almost 4 years, didn't care whether America ended up a slave country or a free country. He just would do whatever necessary to keep the country together. And he wanted Robert E. Lee to be his lead general, but then he found out that he was going to lead the South. Almost like the North was willing to tolerate slavery as long as they could make some money for it, hence doubling the tariffs on southern cities.
They weren't doing it for the right reason.
Right. You want to comment on Reconstruction?
When Grant took office, his motto was let us have peace. But ironically, what ended up happening, it was far from peace. It basically ended up with Southern chaos, Southern riots against Black Americans. If it wasn't for the Black or the Africans have the right to vote, he probably wouldn't have won many Southern states as he did during his first his 2 terms. The thing with him was that he had a lot of corruption under him with the whiskey raids. Americans were getting tired of people of a constant intervention.
It seems like with everything that happened with Lincoln, Johnson, and Grant, that people bought Grant's slogan and they just were so willing to have peace that they were willing to put up with a Southern president, Rutherford B. Hayes, becoming president, even though he didn't exactly win by the formal electoral college process. And so as a result, we lost what could have been, one of the best, least racist Northern liberal Republican presidents who didn't become president, Samuel J. Tilden. And that was 1876 election, which is a mirror of the 2000 and the 2016 and the 1828, I think, where the popular vote didn't win, but because of the electoral college, the Senate, for lack of a better word, determined it.
During that time period, the 1880s, there was really a shift from black civil rights and the whole Reconstruction policy to civil service reform, which basically deals with people getting jobs based on the president paying back a favor for a campaign endorsement or something like that, versus with merit. Merit's the qualification, actually being qualified to actually have that position, and not just because you're a crony of of the president. Garfield wanted to place legislation dealing with civil service reform, but he ended up getting shot by Charles Guiteau, who was a guy who was insane. He ended up dying because he ended up getting shot because he felt like he was owed a position by the Garfield administration. Turns out when you look more and more into Guiteau, he was just insane.
That leads us into Arthur. So did he kind of clean up the spoil system, and is that what led to the economic success of the Gilded Age?
Yep, the Pendleton Civil Service Act of 1883, I believe, which is ironic because Arthur was part of the corrupt spoil system, like a machine, and he ended up, after Garfield got shot and he ended up dying of his doctors trying to save him, he ended up passing that civil service reform. So he kind of shifted from being this old corrupt politician to, being a effective. No, I wouldn't say he was he didn't. There's not a whole lot about him, but there are a few attributes about him that kind of made him a somewhat decent president.
In that way, it seems like Ito almost shot himself in the foot. Like he shot a guy who wouldn't give him a kickback and ended up destroying the whole kickback system and ruining it for everybody, except the people.
I feel like he was in the right mind to know what the heck like civil service reform is. He had nothing to do with President Garfield. He thought that like he was out of position because he like wrote a speech or something. I think Garfield might have used his words or maybe imagined it or something. I don't know. But I feel like he was just insane and he thought he had something to do with like Garfield being elected and he wanted a job from him. Well, separately, the issue of merit reform was happening, and the issues were separate, but they somehow kind of linked up. He didn't sound like he was very competent to even know what he was really trying to go after.
Do you have any comments on Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison?
Grover Cleveland, I believe, was a very good classical liberal. Like he really is one of the not first, but one of the earlier ones in America to really. I know we have the founding fathers, but he really was more of a classical liberal in a sense than a lot of the founding fathers were, I believe. What's interesting about him is that he originally was a sheriff, and then he ran for, I believe, it was governor of New York and won, and then went on to become president. And then when he got defeated in the popular vote, his wife Frances Folsom, or one of the White House's chief executives, one of the top people or something, that take good care of the place will be back in 4 years.
Do you know anything about what Cleveland's like big issues were?
There was a scandal about him having an illegitimate child when he was running against James G. Blaine, and people would say, "Ma, where's my paw?" And when Cleveland won, their response was, "Off to the White House, ha ha ha."
Dirty politics, no respect.
Yeah, mudslinging. And then you have Harrison. He was more of a formal kind of leader. He nearly bankrupted the United States with his McKinley tariff. The name was inspired by President McKinley. Favored protectionist values. And what they said was that what they claimed was that it protected the workers, but what it really did was cause consumer prices to skyrocket.
That probably erased some of the economic gains that were made during the Gilded Age.
Yeah, exactly. And then Cleveland, when he got reelected, he promised to repeal the McKinley tariff, and then he ended up like doing that, but bad crisis happened.
And just to tie this in with the whole left versus right dichotomy, Grover Cleveland is a union-busting Democrat, and Benjamin Harrison is a Republican who favored unions. And again, also, for those who don't know, Benjamin Harrison was the grandson of William Henry Harrison, the Whig, so he was kind of burdened by having to live up to his grandfather's legacy.
It's the only grandfather or grandson to be president.
That brings us to the end of the third-party system. You have any final comments on that?
It was kind of the last of the laid-back era of government control. The fourth and the fifth party systems, and whether the sixth one exists or not, is really when government got really out of hand control. That began with Teddy Roosevelt after McKinley died. Which doesn't make sense to me is that people in the Republican Party wanted to get rid of Teddy Roosevelt. So what they did was they made him vice president. What sense does that make?
Still to this day, you have presidential nominees choosing people who look moderate instead of choosing someone who's like on firm ideological ground. People ask, why didn't Hillary choose Bernie Sanders? Like, because he would have dismantled everything that she did. It's weird. Sometimes presidents do choose someone who will dismantle everything they did, but disagree with them even more broadly. But that's just a matter of party labels and party infighting. Sanders wasn't really a Democrat until he decided to run, so it's not exactly the same.
Yeah, and he ended up leaving the Democratic Party afterward.
That's weird. Like, he's kind of listed as a Democrat.
He ended up leaving and becoming an independent again. He's pretty much like an independent Democrat, which is he's independent, but he caucuses with Democrats, so he's a Democrat basically without being affiliated with them.
We're on the fourth party system now, right? So that's 1890s to 1950s about?
Yeah, the fourth. That was the progressive era, sandwiched in with the conservatives in between FDR and Truman and policies of Roosevelt and Wilson and Taft. It was kind of like a back and forth battle between progressivism and conservatism. Both like progressives and conservatives held the White House for like a long extensive period of time. Well, Taft was more of a conservative, but he had for some progressive. He was less progressive than Roosevelt was. They were of different parties, but they pretty much held the same similar view. Progressivism.
Both parties were struggling over whether to adopt progressivism, and then you had like the Taft conservatives who were kind of almost outside of the whole thing and weren't really susceptible to the big government stuff. And then Robert Taft came later and kind of influenced some libertarians like Goldwater. Ron Paul was influenced by Robert Taft. Another Ohio guy. I meant to ask you, you're from Ohio and you know so many presidents. There were 8 presidents from Ohio. Think you can name all 8?
Yep. Let's see here. Obviously, William McKinley, William Howard Taft, Warren G. Harding. Harrison wasn't born in Ohio. He was born in Virginia, but you don't count him. William Henry Harrison. Grant was born in Ohio. Actually, Harrison was born in Ohio, too.
Or Arthur or Garfield, Ohioans?
Garfield's from Ohio. Arthur wasn't. Oh, yeah, Hayes. Hayes was from Ohio.
All right. I wasn't counting, but that's probably all of them. We'll put up a caption if you missed any.
Getting back to the fourth party system, it's interesting how, like, Americans, they tend to go back and forth between who they want governing them. Like, after World War I and high taxation, they wanted to return to the Grover Cleveland style government with Warren G. Harding and Coolidge. So they voted him in, and he ended up having a lot of scandals after he died. He was kind of overlooked as a really positive factor of the conservative era. Really, Coolidge was probably the one who actually was the very, like, temperament and self-discipline conservative. Because Warren G. Harding, I feel like he didn't have the self-control really when he was president to take charge, because he had people around him that were corrupt. He spent a lot of time focusing on partying, going out golfing, doing all that stuff. He was living kind of the high life of the presidency, and he wasn't really focused on. It should have been. I think it should have been Coolidge, Harding, not the other way around.
Yeah, it's always the tail leading the dog. You know, we elect the most electable, moderate nihilists, you know, like George Bush Sr. Sometimes those guys pick some more principled. If it's Republicans, they usually pick a conservative. If it's a conservative who's the nominee, then they have to pick a running mate who's more towards the moderates, and ends up diluting the message of both inevitably.
I believe that Hoover would have been a really great president if it wasn't for the Great Depression happening. This might be kind of conflicting with libertarian views in a way, but I feel like the economy got so bad to the point where it's just without direct intervention, but like passing some sort of prevention mechanism without stepping on the Constitution would be just temporarily. But I don't know. The problem with that would be that then the government would try to step over their boundary like they have been. When you give people an inch, they take a mile. That's how government is.
You want to step in to correct market failures, but you might end up with a government failure instead of fixing the problem. And that's what FDR did.
I always have that conflicting view, though. I don't want things to go the way they are, continue. There has to be some sort of, but it has to be in a way that endures self-responsibility and self-reliance. Hoover would have been a good president if that never happened. Like he said once, the problem isn't capitalism, the problem is capitalists. They're too damn greedy.
That reminds me of an interesting quote. I think it was G.K. Chesterton, either him or, I don't even know how to say this word, Hilaire Belloc, the guys who invented a philosophy called distributism. This isn't exactly the same idea you said, but they said the problem isn't too much capitalism, the problem is that there are too few capitalists. Not enough people are enjoying the benefits of capitalism.
Because that's where the 1% controls most of the wealth. When that ends up happening, I mean, that's because of a lot of government regulation too as well, but also too because this is kind of totally off topic, and this is kind of what I started thinking, wouldn't it be a good idea to have competing currencies instead of just having the US dollar have currencies that compete with it?
If people like printed money, they can use printed money. If they prefer precious metals, they can do that. If they want to use Bitcoin, they want to have other resource-backed currencies. I propose having states turn their lead exports into currencies, but I imagine that would create kind of a horrible nightmare of producerism, mercantilism, giving all kinds of corporate privileges to domestic production. So there's a possible drawback there. But yeah, there's no reason why currency shouldn't be subject to regular market forces. To say otherwise is to say that it should be illegal to own gold. But, enter FDR.
Yeah. He pretty much, what he did was exactly what I was talking about. He went from taking an inch to taking a mile. A lot of stuff was within good intentions. He kind of ended up overdoing his power. Wanted to seize too much power, make the presidency more powerful for the executive branch, which ultimately leads to dictatorship. Kind of. If it wasn't for him dying at 45, he probably would have ran another term.
He served just over 3 terms and was elected to 4. So Truman was the 5th term of FDR.
If you look at a lot of those elections with Roosevelt, they were all landslides. They were all huge victories. He's probably one of the only people that has ever
not had to fight for their legacy.
Yeah. And Truman, when he took over, he didn't know anything. Within 3 months of his presidency, he was told about the Manhattan Project, and he was clueless about it because he only had one meeting with Roosevelt before he died as vice president. This is one of the coolest ways in a way that a president's taken office. Truman was asked to go to to the White House, and who was waiting for him wasn't FDR, it was his wife, Eleanor. Truman basically asked her, is there anything I can do for you? And she said, no, but is there anything I can do for you? You're the one who's in trouble now.
And so was Truman not FDR's running mate until the last election?
Yeah,
Wow.
44.
Yeah, they'll put you in a constitutional crisis, all right.
And that fourth party system from there on basically tackles communism, the policies of Eisenhower's interventionist policies. Well, also, too, kind of implementing socialist policies at home, like the whole taxation, 90% of them, those who make over 300,000. I noticed that's the common theme of the fourth party system. They want to attack communism, but they ended up somehow bringing it or spreading it at home, or at least socialism.
Yeah, and that set the stage for the 1960 election, which is the turning point of the fourth to fifth party system. It's the last time in recent memory when, besides Hillary Clinton, when the Democrats are the ones who hate the Russians and the communists. I mean, not communists this time, and then it's the Republicans who look weak against Russia, and it's the most ironic thing we can think of, but really we're seeing it in the Clinton versus Trump thing. So maybe the Clinton-Trump thing is the turning point between the fifth and sixth party systems.
Yeah, I definitely would say so. It's almost like the Cold War never really ended, but it shifted from the Soviet Union to just being, Russia and stuff. I still feel like Russia still has ties to, like, Ukraine, still has, like, all that. If Russia wanted to, they could re-establish the Soviet Union.
Do you think Putin wants to do that? Because I think I read once that some people think he does.
Yeah, I've read like that too, where he's kind of, like, some policies he has is like neo-Soviet. Though this one quote kind of makes me think otherwise. He once said that anyone who does not regret the passing of the Soviet Union has no heart. Anyone who wishes it to be restored has no brain.
It's like the Russian Churchill.
I take it that he doesn't really want. I take it that he doesn't want to necessarily start another Soviet Union, but I would see him wanting to start like another collision of nations, though, possibly.
It's like he's got to compliment the Soviet Union first because he was a former KGB agent. I think head of the KGB.
Yeah, he was.
But it's also because he wants to unite all the Russians, and you got to pay some lip service to the times when it was more united in the past in order to do that.
It's interesting how the Cold War progressed from being starting with Truman to the final collapse of the Berlin Wall. So much led to that. There were so many attributes, like the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was a proxy war, like fighting Russia. In the 50s, you had the Korean War. In the 40s, when Truman was president, we lost China to communism. We were trying to fight communism, but we united with China. Everything we see is made in China. In a way, has the Red Scare technically taken over our economic system, and as far as what we buy everything from China, and they're communists.
They're almost state-owned. They have a lot of state-owned companies. It's kind of like the government is the biggest stockholder in all the corporations, and they have a really top-down thing where it's the government that tells the business what to do, and they get all this kind of foreign investment. It's collapsed communism that is kept from collapsing from the investment of foreign capitalists.
I feel like China is globalistically capitalist, but domestically it's communist.
So it's kind of like the fourth party system is associated with the progressive era, and then would you say like the Cold War era associated with the fifth party system?
Yeah, I would consider that. The Cold War is pretty much the big highlight of it.
And it's characterized by proxy wars between the U.S. and Russia, and I think we're seeing echoes of that today with Syria, and like you mentioned, there was Vietnam, and there's also Afghanistan, which we're now celebrating, I think, our 40th year in North Korea.
Oh, yeah. I remember reading about the presidency of Donald Trump on, Wikipedia or something, and it said that, Donald Trump entered the presidency during the longest war in, American history, the Afghanistan War, and it was, 1970-something to, now, and I'm, thinking, wow.
I watched that movie, Charlie Wilson's War. It's so weird to think about how that started under Carter. He's known as the peace president. Never dropped a single bomb the whole 4 years he was in office, but just, see that draw up in Afghanistan and see how that ended. It hasn't ended. Just to see how that played out. It's, people have made comparisons to Alexander the Great, he was the last person to ever conquer Afghanistan, if he even did, I think. Russians couldn't take it, America couldn't take it. Taliban and Al-Qaeda are still fighting over it. It's ungovernable. It's some mountainous, half wasteland.
Yeah, who would want to fuck around there?
Yeah, for those who don't know, there's a place that's called Zomia, Zomia, that encompasses these huge mountainous areas that are really difficult to govern, like Tibet and every area south of it. It probably includes Afghanistan, I'm not sure. but I think it includes most of like Myanmar. So yeah, that'll lead us into anarchy for the next time. The next episode, we're going to talk about libertarianism and anarchism. So that is going to conclude for episode 2 about the two-party systems. So we'll see you next time on the Radical Center podcast. Have a good night.
Yep, have a good night.